run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We're delighted to bring you today an event on the protests in Khabarovsk. This event is part of the Future of Russia series that the Atlantic Council is doing with the support of the Future of Russia Foundation, a UK charity. We have a terrific panel for you today. We have Vladimir Milov, a senior Russian opposition politician and economic advisor to Alexei Navalny, the head of the Russian real opposition. We have Maria Kuznetsova, who's a coordinator at the organization Open Russia, who just spent most of the last week in Khabarovsk. We have Dr. Maria Snegovaya, who's a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins SAIS, as well as a fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. And we have Dr. Donald Jensen, who's director of Russian Strategic Stability at the U.S. Institute of Peace. I'd like to start our conversation with a question for Maria Kuznetsova. Since you were on the ground in Khabarovsk, my question is this: what is happening there? How many people have been demonstrating and for how long? Is this just support for the arrested Governor Furgal, or are there other reasons involved? Maria, over to you.
Okay, so the protest started immediately after the arrest of the governor of the region, Sergei Furgal, who was an exception in many ways. First, he's not from the ruling party, and he's one of the few governors who managed to win the loyalty of the people. So when he was arrested on July 8th, people took it as a public insult and from federal center and took to the streets. Well, by now it's the third week of protest, and usually on weekdays from some hundreds to some thousands people participate every day. And the major strikes take place every Saturday. And I was in Khabarovsk last weekend, and what we saw there was unprecedented. By all the observers, it's considered to be the biggest demonstration so far. It's difficult to say the exact number of participants, but by our estimations, and here we agree with the regional office of Alexei Navalny, there were about 50,000 people on streets that day, and it's about 10% of the population of the city. So from what we see, we have not yet reached the peak of the protest, and probably more people are going to join in the weeks to come. So, well, the first protests focused only on freedom of Sergei Furgal, or at least to have trial on him, not in Moscow, but in Khabarovsk. But the agenda has been changing. So what we saw last weekend is that around half of the posters and chants were not about Furgal, actually. People consider his removal as an attempt to silence the opposition. So step by step, they started to make demands about the resignation of Vladimir Putin, the need to establish the freedom of the press, and to free other political prisoners, not just Furgal, for example, journalist Ivan Safronov and politician Platoshkin. And the federal agenda is something new that we see on the regional protest, actually, because before they were mostly about resolving a particular issue, but not demanding Putin to resign. And two of the most popular slogans now are Russia wake up and Russia get out on the streets. And it's really something new that we see in Khabarovsk. And actually it shows, it shows that agenda is federal, and also that there is no separatism in the region, though many have jumped to this conclusion. Another interesting point I would like to make is that amendments to the constitution is also a big trigger at the protest, though it was not a pretext of it. While talking to the people, I understood that this topic bothered them much more than we could have expected. And it's clear from the fact that almost no protest after the referendum took place, but still people are really concerned and they want changes, so they started to include federal agenda into this protest. So, so what we see there is a change in the general mood of population that was triggered by a local problem. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Maria. Vlad, you've been heavily involved in opposition politics for many years, and you've been watching the situation in Khabarovsk closely. Your thoughts on what's happening there and its greater significance for Russian politics?
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and it's always a pleasure to speak at the Atlantic Council events. Thanks for having me. I'm not in Khabarovsk right now, but I was a frequent visitor in the past decade and very much involved in Khabarovsk politics. I have to say that what's happening is really political. Most of it is political, and it's a very anti-United Russia protests, mainly connected to the fact that the arrested governor, Sergei Furgal, he essentially, what he did is he liberated the region from the vertical of power, the so-called well-known vertical of power that the ruling dominant party, United Russia, has been installing all over the country. And essentially, the people were happy and grateful for that. When he was participating in the governor elections 2 years ago, one cannot say that he got some sort of an overwhelming result. He was sort of leveling off with the incumbent governor, and only in a runoff he received an overwhelming majority, which was clearly a protest vote. I think what we hear right now about his super popularity and his approval ratings in the region being higher than that of Vladimir Putin, this has obviously mostly to do with his performance as a governor, because he essentially changed the style of leading the region. He talked to people, he traveled across, he essentially removed the veil between authorities and the population, because right now I'm here in Moscow. Moscow is probably one of the worst places in the country where authorities don't listen to citizens. They are just totally disconnected and pursue whatever agenda they think is best. The channels of communication and influence from bottom to top are totally absent. Now, Furgal has turned that around big time in Khabarovsk region. His ratings went up significantly while he was in power. People started to hear the real truth about local way of living on the regional television. He did scrap some of the financing for the bureaucracy in favor of redistributing money to the social programs and so on. So I think also important to add that this anti-United Russia sentiment has been building for quite some time. You will remember, I'm sure, the dramatic elections of State Duma back in 2011, after which we had a major protests in Moscow and across the country. Khabarovsk had voted in support of the ruling party far less than the average Russia and Moscow. It was in 2011, it was 49% for United Russia nationwide, 47 in Moscow, and 38 in Khabarovsk. Obviously, not only the region had elected non-United Russia governor 2 years ago, but a year ago, they had completely wiped off United Russia from regional and city legislatures. There's like almost none members of parliament left from the ruling party. So the reason why the Far East, I would say not only Khabarovsk, but Vladivostok, who's also seen notable rallies in support of Furgal recently, Far East generally has been a net loser of Putin's economic system. It is widely perceived in the region that it is being but exploited in favor of a handful of Putin's oligarchs who get most of the lucrative revenue from exploiting natural resources or federal funding for the so-called national projects like bridges, airports, whatever. Whereas in reality, the Far Eastern regions, the Far Eastern people, they don't get much of a benefit. This is actually proven by the official statistics, because 20 years ago, the average salary, for instance, in those regions, in Khabarovsk and Primoria, was substantially higher than the average salary throughout Russia. Now it's leveled off at best, or even lower, like in Vladivostok. So there is a widespread sentiment that Far Eastern residents have been net losers of Putin's system, which has been more like a colonial exploitant system, which you can often hear that in specific slogans on the ground: "Stop exploiting us for the benefit of federal cronies." So I think this was important to understand. This was a long brewing protest. It's rooted back in years. It was also very gradual. So the growth in anti-United Russia sentiment was pretty gradual and culminated only recently. But I think you can see the mood on the streets of Khabarovsk. People are coming from across the region to take part. They just don't want to let go. Once they took back power from the United Russian monopoly, they just don't want to let go. And I think there is no way that Putin can offer a solution to completely calm the region down. Even if he tries to do so, it will pay off dramatically in the subsequent years. They will not forget what happened. They will continue to stand against this colonial Putin's federal power. And Khabarovsk is becoming one of the regions, is far from being the only one. We can remember Arkhangelsk and the garbage crisis out there. There is also Primoria, there is Irkutsk, there is Novosibirsk. I can go on for a long time, but believe me, it's not the only region where the protest sentiment has been brewing for some time. Now it had burst out, and it quickly turned out to be fairly political. People pretty much realized that they're against the system, highly monopolized political system, which also exploits them economically, doesn't give them much benefit at all. So that's the brief description of the picture. We'll be happy to take on in the Q&A session.
That was fascinating. Thank you, Vlad. And you also lead to my next question, which is for Don. The Kremlin reaction to the protests in Khabarovsk seems nuanced. No dispatch of security forces, the crackdown, the appointment of a new governor from the same party as Furgal, Mikhail Diktyarov of the Liberal Democratic Party. Why do you think that is, Don?
Well, first of all, John, thank you for having me on. I guess I would disagree with the characterization of Moscow's response as nuanced. I think they were surprised. I think they are not very good at reading grassroots movements, and we've seen that elsewhere. We've seen that in their surprise, I think, to the resistance to Russian invasion in Ukraine. So I think they were surprised. They had a number of alternatives available to them, and they went, not surprisingly, with an administrative one, picking a guy who really no one had ever heard of. He's more or less of the same party, so that I guess they hoped would maybe help continuity. So I think right now they're watching it carefully. I don't think they're quite alarmed enough to send in some kind of security forces to crack heads. I think we're a ways from that still. But I very much agree with Vladimir and what Maria said, which is that to the extent that it becomes political, not based on a single grievance, I think that is going to become a problem if it continues. And I do think whether it continues on the streets or in the hearts and minds of the people, as Vladimir said, this is going to be a continuing problem. But it shows in many ways the regime's lack of understanding of what's going on in the country, because they react in a way that may ultimately, it is already showing to be very inadequate.
Okay, Don, thank you. Thank you. Tensions between Moscow, which is, of course, the center of Russian political life, and the regions have been a growing feature of the Putin system in recent years. Maria Stangovaya, how do you see this issue playing out in Khabarovsk?
Yeah, thank you very much, Ambassador, for having me and such an interesting conversation. So Khabarovsk is both a continuation, I would say, of the trend that existed before, as our previous speakers have emphasized. At the same time, it has also new elements. So first of all, just a couple of days ago, Levada Center has published new polls of support for Putin. And again, this trend that we observed before continues. So there's a decline in support. As a matter of fact, Putin's trust rating has declined to 23%, which is very low. And his approval rating is at 60%, which looks like a lot, but again, authoritarian regimes have their own ways of showing disapproval. It's very unsafe to say, I don't like Putin publicly. So essentially, this 60% means that a third of the population says they don't approve of Putin. And we've only witnessed similar levels back in 2011, 2013, again, against the backdrop of large countrywide protests in Russia. This is all happening against also the growth of social unrest and dissatisfaction with the economic outcomes. We, at this point, have a 7-year decline of real disposable incomes in Russia. And this is all exacerbated by the pandemic economic crisis, which is going to even further worsen the situation. Last year, as a result of this dynamic, the wave of protests spread across many regions in Russia, from Arkhangelsk and Yekaterinburg to Kalmykia and Ingushetia. As a matter of fact, looking at the regions, only 2 of them did not have any kind of protest whatsoever, and the large one definitely took place in Yekaterinburg and Arkhangelsk, Ingushetia, Neninsky autonomous districts, etc. The new thing about the Khabarovsk and this situation is not the fact of the protests per se, which honestly just looks just as a continuation of this countrywide trend, but the scale of the protest. As Maria has mentioned, by different estimates, up to 10% of residents are in the streets. And for example, in Moscow, it would be analogous to 1 million of people taken to the streets, which is a lot. So the protest continues, spreads countrywide, and it also grows in size. The other interesting development is that there is also a support for protests growing countrywide. The same Levada Center shows that of people who have heard about the Khabarovsk protests in Russia, which about 83%, about half of them, 45% support Khabarovsk protests. Again, this is very new. This is something we haven't only witnessed in the recent years, not a typical dynamic for Russia. In the past, most people would not even hear about those protests and definitely do not support them. We actually saw the beginning of this trend last year, when in Moscow, when the Moscow protests have erupted, and for the first time, Levada again reported that 23% of Russians supported the protest, about the same number that did not support. But we see that right now, the number of people who support has actually also grown. Another interesting factor that characterizes this dynamic is also that regions are increasingly more supportive of each other. So this, in the past, the regional protests tended to be localized, so they were centered around regional agenda, and other regions usually ignored them. Instead, what we see this time is, for example, last week, there were multiple actions in support of Khabarovsk protests in different regions, in cities as different as Moscow, Krasnodar, Yekaterinburg, Irkutsk, Surgut, and even in Birobidzhan, a relatively small city in the Jewish autonomous district, also held support for Khabarovsk protests. So this suggests that, as I mentioned before, that we see that this agenda continues and spreads countrywide. As of now, the Kremlin looks relatively strong still, and most likely will be able to take Khabarovsk protests under certain type of control. But in the long term, that's definitely the situation that's going to be harder and harder for the Kremlin to manage. And the last point I wanted to make is the role that the economic factors play in all this, because as I mentioned before, it's the economy specifically that represents at this point one of the key challenges for the sustainability of the Kremlin regime. So as our previous commentators have mentioned, it's true that the agenda has not been primarily economic in nature. It tends to, honestly, from region to region, the reasons why the trigger protests tend to be very different, from environmental factors to territorial disputes. But this is all happening against this, as I said, the continuous economic stagnation and increasing spreading feeling of lack of opportunities within the society. And that's unlikely to change in the near future and will only worsen. Plus, with the Free Russia Foundation last year, we published a report that also statistically shows that the support for the Kremlin appointees is lower in the regions that experience a decline in the real disposable income. So overall, this suggests that the economic factors maybe not trigger the protests yet, but they create this overall backdrop, the background against which any factor eventually can become a trigger. So overall, just to conclude, challenges are growing for the Putin, and what we see is a strengthening of the countrywide protests.
Okay, thank you, Maria. I was particularly struck by the statistic that shows that 45% of the Russian people who were polled by Levada would support those protests. Vlad, again, you've been watching this for many years. Your sense as to how this fracture between the center and the regions is going to play out for Russian politics?
First, I would want to add some small comment about the LDPR party, because I hear there's a lot of analysis connected with the popularity of LDPR and the fact that Kremlin have picked up an LDPR guy to lead the region after Furgal. Now, it's important to understand that generally speaking, for Khabarovsk residents, LDPR is nothing. How you can judge that is if you look at the results of the presidential vote in March 2018. Zhirinovsky finished a distant third with a result below 10%. He lost like twice to Grudinin, the communist candidate. And obviously, this was just half a year before the governor elections, where Furgal won. So a lot of analysts amplify this LDPR factor, but I think you should clearly understand that this is about Furgal and his style of governance, new style that he brought to the region in the past couple of years. It's definitely, I think it's Kremlin's miscalculation that this has really something to do with LDPR. It has not. Now, on how it will play out, I think it's important to understand that there is no short way from point A to point B in the Russian politics. It's all, very, very gradual, very sequential. What we're seeing right now, and I'll follow up on what Maria had commented, is like a gradual fall of popularity of not just Putin, but this very centralized system and the one-party rule in one region after another. So what we saw happening is like several important regions have become completely lost for Kremlin in terms of control. It's going to be big trouble in the next federal elections. I don't know, frankly, how they're going to get 25, 30% in regions like Khabarovsk, Novosibirsk, or Arkhangelsk. So that what we see is not a straight pattern when most regions embrace the same attitude. The origins of such attitude and protest mood is different from one region to another. Might be environmental, might be just like total disrespect for the population, like we have in Moscow, despite more or less good economic situation. Might be what we have in the Far East, dissatisfaction with economic performance over 20 years. But what we see is the territory which is not really under control of Putin is expanding. It's good news. It probably is not going to be a very fast protest, but on the next federal election, as we saw in this constitutional vote already, it's going to be very difficult for Putin to defend his results and achieve a victory in regions like that. And there are more and more regions like by the month. So I think a Khabarovsk event will influence a lot of developments in other regions as well. Again, don't expect some windfall of protest eruptions like that. But that's an important development which was seen across the country, noted across the country, and it will play a very, very significant role in this gradual but solid process of dismantling of the vertical of power.
What you're suggesting is that in 2024, if President Putin is again running for the office, he'll have to rely on even greater fraud to achieve the results he wants.
Oh, absolutely. I have to say, even before that, take a look at what happened at the last federal parliamentary elections 4 years ago. There was an unprecedented share of votes that United Russia ruling party have got from just a handful of electoral sultanates, what we call, which is North Caucasus and Middle Volga national republics plus Crimea. Just a dozen of regions gave them more than a third of the vote. That's unprecedented. Previously, they were like, 15, 20% of the total vote, right? So the only way they can show a good federal result right now is to squeeze even more votes from a dozen of regions where the vote is like totally controlled, 100%, right? So that was a very difficult situation for Putin already 4 years ago. Would be even more so in the next state Duma elections whenever they take place.
Okay, thank you. Very, very interesting.
Don, could I add a point here?
Jump in.
Yeah, again, I think it's really highly significant that this happened, only 10 days after the referendum in a region that supported Putin's bill. This is must be highly troubling for anybody in the Kremlin who's paying attention to what's happening. This is not supposed to have happened after a referendum that seemed designed to not only approve Putin's leadership, but give legitimacy to the system. And immediately they're back on the streets.
Okay, thank you. Maria Kuznetsova, again, since you were recently in Khabarovsk, any sense if locals have an opinion about the new Governor Diktarov. Any sense the demonstrations are going to go smaller or stop?
So, well, actually, I would say that the appointment of Mikhail Diktarov actually has added fuel to the protest because people are outraged with this decision for some reasons. First, Khabarovsk is a region where the governance has always been local, so there was no precedent that the governor was from outside the region. And Diktarov is not even from the Far East. He's from central Russia, so and he never visited Khabarovsk for long periods of time. And another reason why people hate him now is his condensing attitude and his rejection to go out and speak directly to the people, because during Furgal's rule it was quite usual that he spoke to the people and they're used to that. And now I think it's clear that people won't accept him in any way. And even at demonstrations, people chant something like "Misha, go away," and all of that. And I would also like to repeat that the biggest rally took place last Saturday after the appointment of Mikhail Diktarov, and even marches on weekdays that happen every day. They have grown up since then. And especially after he showed up for 15 minutes on a Sunday night at 11 p.m. on street just to make some short video and disappear. Actually, I think that this anger now in Khabarovsk extends to Liberal Democratic Party. So I agree here with Vladimir. Actually, people expected the party to support Furgal, but rather than that, the party agreed on Degtyaryov. So people now think that it's a betrayal, and no matter how the situation is going to resolve, it's clear that in the next elections in Khabarovsk, LDPR won't get such a majority of seats in the city as they have now, and probably Communist Party will take more seats than they have. Yeah, so that's it.
Okay. The protests, Maria.
Uh-huh.
I mean, obviously they're going full force, but we haven't seen, correct me if I'm wrong, any specific demands from them. Correct?
Well, I would say that there is no something that's really united, but people want to have a trial in Khabarovsk over Furgal, and it's the main point. But other than that, it's just general political slogans like Putin resign and all of that. So, because the movement is completely grassroots, so there is no particular demands, because there is no leader who can formulate them.
You believe it's hard to imagine that the Kremlin would agree to his being tried in Khabarovsk, but if they were, would that calm things down?
I think maybe for some time, yes, but it also depends if who will be the governor of the region, because definitely no one would agree on Degtyaryov, because he just make people much more angry than before.
All right, Don, over to you. If things do not calm down, or if there are still demonstrations a month from now, would you expect a crackdown?
I would expect the chances to rise, but I think right now the Kremlin prefers to ignore it and let it simmer down on its own, perhaps with a little help from the law enforcement authorities. But keep in mind that this is a real logistical and practical problem to crack down way out there, so far from Moscow, among the troops that may or may not ultimately be reliable. I've seen some media stories that the Rosgvardia and some of the other interior forces are around, but not in large numbers. So I think, John, this will be a last resort, and they'd rather maybe even just let it simmer for a long time rather than take the political chance that overtly intervening would increase the opposition, as Vladimir and Maria have described.
All right, but just correct me if I'm wrong. Didn't they send special forces to Vladivostok when they had the demonstrations there? Yeah,
sorry.
please jump in.
Yeah, sorry, Ambassador. May I interfere? Because yes, they did send external forces to Vladivostok, but only after a long, huge protests have essentially died out to like 200 or 300 people, and it was like so badly met that 10 years after, it's still a big story. People are still angry about how they done it and how they dissented this protest. And it was also not a big political protest, but it was the protest against ban of imports of foreign cars where they drive on the right. So it was not a political thing. It was already exhausted, small, and still people remember. And this is serving as a negative example regionally. Now it's really very hard to crack down in that region because you have to understand that how is it done in Moscow? Who actually beats us up in Moscow? All this riot police. These are all imported folks. These are folks that specifically are recruited in the regions that are like 500-600 miles away, very poor, Bryansk, Ivanov, whatever, right? There's no job, no perspective, no nothing, but they bring them in Moscow, pay them a relatively good salary by their standards and say, your job is to beat Muscovites, that is a very specific inter-regional story. You don't have anything of that sort in the Far East. And if they would only dare to bring outside forces to do this stuff, this will outrage people. So this will make things worse, which is, I think, the major reason why they don't do it now. And then again, they probably think that Khabarovsk is not so much of a federal importance. It's like totally muted on federal TV, which means politically non-existent by Putin's standards. If it's not on federal TV, I mean, then it's non-existent. So they will try to wait it out, I think, without a major crackdown, save the specific targeted crackdown on activists who might get some administrative arrest terms, some fines, whatever, which has already begun right now. But I don't expect a major crackdown on a large numbers of people.
But is it your understanding, Vlad, as Maria said, that this is completely a grassroots phenomenon? So they're not leaders who are orchestrating this.
It is a complete grassroots phenomenon because, look, we have been expecting something like that to happen in Khabarovsk, but not to that extent. Not that people would come out from distant cities by roads, by feet to join, which is, I mean, you have a lot of this stuff on YouTube, how residents of the region do that. Nobody expected that. So this is right. This is a complete grassroots movement. However, again, when we speak about political slogans, it's shifting by the minute. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, it was largely apolitical, just bring us back Furgal, right? Mm-hmm. Right now, it's dominating federal level political slogans against Putin, against United Russia. So this dynamics is extremely good. And I mean, it's not the end of story. This will continue and evolve. So just give it some time.
Okay, thank you. Maria Snegovaya, I have two questions for you. First, how has the Kremlin media been portraying the demonstrations?
So shall I answer it first? Sure. So first of all, I wanted to follow up on what other speakers have been saying. Thank you very much. Yeah, sorry for interesting discussion. I think there's some overlap in our connection. Sorry. So first of all, I wanted to follow up with what other speakers have said. I think at least I'm following Alexei Vorsin Telegram, who is the head of Navalny's essentially organization in Khabarovsk, and he said that among possible proposals, one particular topic that's been discussed by the protesters is to ban anyone who has not spent in Khabarovsk over 10 years from becoming a governor. I don't know, maybe Maria will correct me to what extent that's one of the possible agendas that has emerged in the near future. Now on the crackdown, honestly, I think personally the Kremlin is a relatively difficult situation because the single voting day is coming on September 13th, where, as been said before, mostly the regions from Siberia and Far East are less represented, but there are several regions that will be electing the governors, like the Jewish Autonomous Region or Nenetsk an autonomous district, where some potential issues may emerge. If all of that is taking place against the continuing protests in Khabarovsk, I think it might create certain risks for the Kremlin that the protests will spread, particularly if, as we expect, multiple falsifications take place on this voting date. So I would imagine that the Kremlin will try to do anything possible, maybe short of the crackdown, to just try and convince, to dissuade the protests ahead of that time in August, essentially. And now, of course, on the media. So it's very interesting because the coverage was extremely inconsistent and sort of reflective of the internal disputes within, I don't know, the pro-Kremlin media regarding the coverage. First of all, as Vladimir has mentioned, the key approach seems to be just to silent. The whole issue does not exist. And it's funny because when the mainstream TV channels report from, like a correspondent reports from Khabarovsk, she tries to find the location, a spot where with no background, because for God's sake, to avoid getting on camera, this citywide protests happening. So they try to find a spot where she's standing behind in front of a tree or a wall, so that nothing is happening on the background, because who knows, what you accidentally may show. Second of all, there were also inconsistent attempts to portray the protesters in all kind of negative lights. There was, of course, attempt to say that they're violating all kind of medical standards because they're protesting throughout the coronavirus situation, violating the quarantine restrictions. Then some media attempted to portray Furgal as a criminal, and so how can a cause that defends a criminal really be supported? And of course, our favorite one is trying also to find the organizers. And of course, that's very consistent with the Kremlin's own conspirological thinking. Some of the elites, of course, are convinced that there is some shadow organizers behind this protest, and the possible suspects ranged from the LDPR and Furgal's own team to even the United States. Even the Russian Foundation featured as one of the possible organizers behind the protests. I should say, in that case, they should have been really efficient to be able to do that on such a large scale. And ultimately, there was also an attempt to say there was a terrorist attack planned throughout this protest, again, in an effort to essentially portray the protesters in negative lights. But overall, as we know, there's something that is absent from the agenda does not exist, as Vladimir said. So it looks like the main approach right at the moment, just to ignore the issue, silent it, and so hoping that it will disappear. Doesn't work anymore as well, I should say, as I mentioned before, because most of the Russians are on the internet these days, and this is where they get the information. And that's why the polls show that the majority of Russians are still aware, know about the protest, and at least half of those who know about them support the protesters.
Okay.
May I add a bit on what? Actually, it's interesting that not only federal media doesn't portray what happens in Khabarovsk, but actually regional TV in Khabarovsk doesn't portray what happened in the city, and people are completely outraged with that. And so actually, as far as I understand, they just say that they will, do something to that company if they show that protest happening, but people are completely outraged because they believed local TV to support them, and when it didn't happen, people just turned out to social medias.
Okay, thank you. We have a variety of questions from our audience. I'll start with one. Let's see. Follows up on a little something that Maria Sangovaya said. Regarding the regional elections, the Far East governorships coming up in September, what is the impact of this protest going to be on those elections? Maria, you want to comment directly, and I'll turn to Vlad.
Me? Which Maria?
Snegovaya, excuse me.
Thank you. So thank you very much for that. It's very important. I believe, as I said, luckily for the Kremlin, most of those elections that are coming are not going to be in Far East or in Siberia, the rebellious regions, so to speak. But there will be problems. First of all, there's about 20 regions total. This is all happening against the backdrop of continuing economic crisis, and the summer will end. People will come back and realize that things have gotten worse and so it's likely to even further deepen the dissatisfaction. As I mentioned before, the Jewish autonomous region will be probably problematic. There was a protest there in support of Khabarovsk protesters recently. There will be difficult elections in Komi and Arkhangelsk region, especially in the Donetsk autonomous region, where they will be essentially have to vote for the governor that was imposed on them. And the Kremlin is quite aware of the whole situation. I'm sure that you are familiar with multiple recent electoral amendments that have been passed that, first of all, make it much, much harder for independent candidates to run, even harder than it used to be. It was already extremely hard. In addition, of course, they extended the voting period to 3 days, which, as we know from the recent constitutional vote, creates multiple options for all kinds of falsifications. So the question is not so much whether the elections will be falsified and who is going to win. Also, it's sort of hard to analyze because we don't know who will be allowed to run at this point. But the falsifications are out of question. It's very clear based on the kind of recently introduced amendments. But the question is, will it annoy and irritate people to such an extent that they will take in the streets in the higher number of regions? And I think it's possible. For example, as I mentioned before, in the Donetsk autonomous district or Jewish autonomous region, especially if Khabarovsk lasts until then. Therefore, once again, I would imagine that the Kremlin will try to use August to the best of its capacity to try and sort of dissuade the ongoing protests in Khabarovsk.
Thank you. Vlad, do you want to comment on this as well?
Yeah, I would strongly advise to also watch the electoral campaign in Irkutsk, which is also one of these breakaway protest regions. They have voted out United Russia many times at governor elections, mayor elections, and they're absolutely outraged by this similar installed outside puppet as an acting governor now. I think because these regions, they have much more solidarity across the board than with European Russia. So I think the echo of Khabarovsk is also possible to be heard in Irkutsk. This will play out in regional elections. That's a thing to watch, despite all the attempts to falsify them, introduce the 3-day voting, and you heard about that stuff, I'm sure. I think Irkutsk will not easily give up and sort of execute revenge for the attempts to also remove the elected governor and reinstall United Russia's power.
Thank you. We have a question from Marjorie Baltzer. Are there differences in protest attitudes among the regions where there are minority nationalities and where those where there are Russian nationalities, where the Russian people are more ethnic Russians are the majority?
Well, if I may, I have to say that essentially where regions where ethnic minorities dominate, they also tend to follow the consolidated pattern of behavior. Not like that they're uniform against, supportive of the authorities and against joining the opposition, but they are like more likely to follow the same, shall I say, tribal rules, which is why in the national ethnic minority dominated republics, you have a much more consolidated vote. That's a pattern, right? However, it's not uniform. For instance, we saw examples in Tatarstan or Bashkiria at the polling stations, which were heavily monitored by independent observers. Essentially, you got more or less similar results than in the rest of the country. And only there where monitors were absent, basically, you had this 95 or something % for stuff that we know from the Soviet times. So again, there is some specific pattern. Ethnic Russian regions tend to be like more anti-Putin, more anti-United Russia as a general rule.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Chase Winter regarding the Liberal Democratic Party. Are they satisfied by the fact that Furgal has been replaced by Diktaryov, one of theirs? Is this really not an important political question or not, the position of the LDP? Actually, Vlad, I'll give this to you.
Yeah, sorry if I may. They are in a very, very tight spot right now. LDPR and Zhirinovsky are in a very tight spot because the fundamentals of their contract with the Kremlin is that they can play an opposition in the allowed space, right? But they should not stick their head out way too much, which Furgal did. So they have a lot to lose, but they also understand that essentially, I think Zhirinovsky understands that basically they violated the contract and Furgal became a political heavyweight, dismantled United Russia dominance, which was something that, and gained the real bottom-up popularity. This is something which is not allowed to do by the Kremlin. So they sort of try to pass underneath the radar now. I mean, keep their positions in the region, but not irritate Kremlin too much. It's a tough game. I don't think they're very successful at playing it, and I think many people in the region are already noticing that, and LDPR has got a lot of negativity during the very recent protests.
Yeah, thank you. Paul Van Doren had worked in Russia a decade ago, a little bit more, and he was out in the Russian Far East, and he was struck by the disconnect, political and otherwise, between Moscow and the Far East. His question is, he thinks that it's possible to see serious economic cooperation between the Russian Far East with the major powers of East Asia, meaning China, Japan, Korea. But there's been little such cooperation. Is this possible? Because this could obviously be a great engine for economic growth in the Far East. Maria Snegovaya, I'll turn this to you if others may want to comment.
It's an interesting question. I guess, first of all, whether it's not up to the regions to decide, right? Because Russia, contrary to what it is believed to be, not really a federalized country, but really quite a unitary state where a lot of decisions are taken made from the center. By the way, Khabarovsk is on less losing side of this relationship, because unlike richer regions that tend to actually give a lot of money to Moscow as part of this sort of economic system that exists in Russia, Khabarovsk actually receives more or less as much as it gives. So in this sense, it's not on the losing side of this relationship with the federal center. But the problem, of course, and I'm sure Vladimir, for example, will be able to explain it a bit better, that first of all, most of those developments that take place and economic exchanges that take place with neighboring countries are controlled by the federal center, and they're not as much delegated to the regional level. And second of all, there's also, of course, a threat that comes from the neighboring countries like China. So there is this a lot of dissatisfaction, for example, with the penetration of Chinese businesses in the region. I personally have been to Irkutsk, and I've heard so many bad things about China. I've never heard being in Moscow or St. Petersburg. And the problem is, at least the way it was portrayed by the people on the ground, is that while the Chinese businesses come to the region, they don't really live much in the region. They create their own chains of economic exchange, where essentially everything they do in the region, they benefit their own businesses. And that's, of course, done
in Africa as well, about the Chinese.
What's
you hear that about the Chinese in Africa as well.
So I think it's a model, and of course it's facilitated through the corruption schemes. So I'm not trying to justify the behavior of the officials in Russia, who definitely legitimize these schemes through bribes and all kind of incentives. So from this perspective, under existing, as long as the political structures exist the way they are right now in Russia, I don't think it's really possible to seriously talk about the development. I'm sure it's possible, and that's unfortunate reality for the regions, and that's why one of the reasons why they're so disappointed with the federal center. I'm sure it's possible to change in the future, but as of now, I don't really see a lot of opportunities for that to be the case.
Okay, thank you.
Can I have
comment on the question? Okay, we have a question here actually from an anonymous person asking. Is there any impact in Kaliningrad from the protests in Khabarovsk? So from one part of Russia to the other. I see Vlad smiling. You want to make a shot? Take a shot?
Now, as a matter of fact, there is probably some echo, because Kaliningrad traditionally was one of the very protest regions. As a matter of fact, it was one of the first regions which had broke out in major protests back in 2010. The first major regional protest against Putin's system 10 years ago. It has somewhat calmed down, which I think might look like a sort of a proto scenario for Khabarovsk. It did calm down on surface, but the popularity of the authorities have actually never restored. So Kaliningrad, I would dare say, is one of the regions which are fundamentally lost, and Putin receives relatively lower results there, not to mention United Russia Party, as opposed to the rest of the country. Yes, people who are politically active in Kaliningrad, they obviously follow those events, they hear those echoes and so on, and I think it is possible that in the future, when they will have particularly to decide on governorship, which is essential in the Russian system, the question of governorship is essential to all regional and local politics, right? At the moment when they will have to decide, we might see some similar events occurring there, because yes, Kaliningrad is a very protest-minded region indeed.
Okay, thank you.
May I add an interesting fact?
Yes.
Yeah. Because actually in Khabarovsk, you can also see the echo of other protests actually in Belarus, because on marches, there were a lot of banners in support of Belarus in Khabarovsk and the protests that happened there. So you can see the solidarity with like Russian-speaking people like across the borders.
Actually, Maria, you just anticipated Bill Courtney's question. It was precisely that, any connection between the two, Ambassador Courtney. So thank you. All right. We have a question from Mark McNamee, Deputy Director for Europe at Duck Frontier and a SICE grad. He's wondering any impact of what's happening here on the 2021 Duma elections. Don, you want to take a shot at that?
What? Sure. I think it's inevitable. It's going to have an impact, and I think the regime is going to be even more unpopular than it is now. But this gets me to a larger point I wanted to make, John, that both Maria's and Vladimir and I are saying, which is that the current system can no longer accommodate Russia as it is today. And I fully expect a reset or reformatting of the system with new parties or new constituencies that the center tries to organize to accommodate all these demands for change. And frankly, I don't think it's able to do that from the center. I think we're going to enter a political crisis relatively soon.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple of questioners who wonder if these growing problems for Mr. Putin domestically will encourage him to some foreign adventure. Let's see. Maria Snegovaya, would you want to take a shot at that?
Thank you. Yeah, I actually did some recent research on that, and I'll be glad to answer. So my research and also existing polls demonstrate that the relationship is different, that Russians are actually more supportive of foreign policy adventurism, let's put it nicely, when the economy is doing better. So in that situation, you feel, all right, more or less things are good at home, and so why not go essentially help our brothers and sisters, I don't know, in Ukraine, for example. But when the domestic situation is not doing well, this is when you start being really surprised that your government is so active abroad rather than solving domestic situations. So, and I ran recently a small survey, essentially it's so-called experimental survey. I'm not going to be boring, bothering you with the methodology, but the idea is you divide the sample into two identical group of people, and you tell one of them the economy is doing better, and you say the other group of people the economy is doing worse. And then you ask them certain questions about Russia's foreign policy. And universally, what we see is that the people who've been told that the economy is doing worse, they're way less supportive of any international adventurism. Because the argument is, of course, because the salience of domestic policy increases, and people are not at all supportive of wasting resources, be it on defense budget or some kind of additional monetary funding into foreign policy, foreign other countries, essentially. So from this perspective, I definitely believe that the Kremlin considers this possibility, definitely may be doing something like that, for example, in Belarus, but it's not going to be very helpful in terms of electoral support, because these people are not really supportive of those actions at this particular moment. So I would think that if something happens in Belarus, for example, and if the Kremlin intervenes there, it would be primarily for geopolitical reasons rather with a domestic support in mind.
Would anyone else like to jump in on this?
May I also add something? It's very important to understand that all the recent Putin's foreign policy adventures were relatively cost-free. He's very afraid to get engaged in adventures that are very costly in terms of finance or in terms of human lives, right? He remembers the Afghanistan experience and the toll that it took on the Soviet Union. So in Syria, we only have an air bombing campaign, no troops on the ground except Wagner, but we don't know who those people are, and they are not ours, and so on. Same in Donbass. You know who are the people most brutally suppressed in Russia? I think even more the political opposition or the environmental activists. Those who speak up against all the restrictions set by FSB, that their relatives have been killed in Donbass and brought into Russia back to be buried somewhere. That's a top secret. I mean, they crash on everybody who tries to speak about that, to keep the presence in Donbass off the radar, off the media, and so on. So it's important. And Crimea obviously was a snap operation without any major costs involved. So for Putin, he was never involved recently in any high costly foreign policy adventure. So when you ask about this option, please think about one which will come without cost to him. I think any Belarus, the Baltic states, Africa, Middle East, whatever. Right now, I think everybody figured out about who Russians are and what they do. So I think most likely than any of such adventures will have high cost to him, which is a prohibitive factor vis-a-vis domestic politics. You should take that into consideration.
Okay, we have a question from Simply Charles, wondering if what's happening in Khabarovsk is going to lead to a tightening of authoritarian controls. I would say, think of that in terms of Russia as a whole, not necessarily in Khabarovsk.
May I quickly address that? Kirill Rogov had a very good article that came out right after the constitutional amendments vote. Kirill Rogov, Russia's brilliant political analyst, he said, and what the amendment vote has demonstrated is, first of all, the dissatisfaction is high, right? By exit poll estimates, by the independent polling numbers. Again, we don't have any good data on that, but we do know that a lot of people voted against or were not happy with this amendment. It's clear it's in there. But at the same time, the more mobilization of people and the readiness to say no wasn't high enough, wasn't sufficiently high. So what it means overall is that people is quite aware that Putin is quite aware that he's no longer welcome by many Russians. But he also sees that the mobilization capacity isn't high enough. So in that situation, what is left is repressions. So unfortunately, because the Kremlin remains relatively strong to be able to use this repressive apparatus to silence those who are not very happy with the current situation. Unfortunately, given this dynamic, it's likely that the repressions will intensify. And if anything, this repressions against Furgal, his arrest was just the first one of the few recent examples of this intensification of the repressions.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else want to comment on this?
May I also add a couple of words on repressions? As we always have this steady pattern of repressions being intensified, step by step, bit by bit, but that's the road we're going. However, there are limits to what they can do. And there's a very clear factor, which Putin is also aware. When we had protests in Moscow a year ago, and they put us all in jail, including myself, more people came to the streets. It was a record number of protesters on the streets since Bolotnaya and Sakharova, because people were this time protesting against the repression and not this other political stuff that we were debating before, right? He knows about that effect. So there are limits to what they can do, which means that if we do have more resolve to push forward, repressions will not stop the protest.
Okay, thank you very much. Our time is, I think, already up. I'd like to thank the two Marias, Don and Vlad, for a wonderful conversation. And I'd like again to thank the Future of Russia Foundation for working with us to make this possible. And thank you all for tuning in.